second language rarely spoken in the world today. It is the language of truth, of compassion, of justice. One clear voice has been speaking this language forcefully and eloquently for half a century. He is our speaker tonight, Ramsey Clark. Ramsey Clark began his life in Dallas, Texas in 1927. His father was a distinguished attorney who became a Supreme Court Justice of these United States. In 1945, Ramsey Clark served in the Marine Corps. Then he went to the University of Texas for his baccalaureate and master's degrees, and to the University of Chicago for his law degree. In 1961, President Kennedy appointed him Assistant Attorney General. And in 1963, President Johnson appointed him to be Attorney General of the United States. At this point, his father resigned his place on the Supreme Court so that there would be no conflict of interest. He was the first United States Attorney General to propose the abolition of the death penalty. Ramsey Clark supervised the federal prisons at Ole Miss following the admission of James Meredith, the first black student. He supervised the federal enforcement protecting the march from Selma to Montgomery and headed the presidential task force to Watts following the riots. He has defended many heroes of our time, written persuasive books, and continues to be active in the fields of international law, constitutional law, criminal justice, the death penalty, human rights, and civil rights. He's received over 20 honorary doctorates from various universities. And he dreams of, quote, a gentle people living in a just society, unquote. Welcome, Ramsey Clark.
Look at all those peacemakers. I must be in heaven. It's wonderful to see so many people here who care about peace at a time of maximum peril to that most necessary condition for human decency. Listening to the Gay Men's Choir tonight reminded me of a very short piece that Kurt Vonnegut wrote some years ago, 10 or 12 years ago in The Nation. Vonnegut had witnessed the firebombing of Dresden, beautiful little city, destroyed, 125,000 people died. He was a prisoner of war. And his book tried to capture what he learned, called Slaughterhouse 5. But in The Nation, he wrote that in all his life, And he's had an extremely full life, full of experience, bad and good. Only two things ever really amazed him. One was the Sermon on the Mount, and the other was music. And music is amazing. It can lift the spirits, and it can make peace. My subject tonight is pretty grim, so you better get your handkerchiefs out. It's something you don't like to have to start with, but if you really love your country, when you see that it's wrong on something of fundamental importance, you have to speak out. Anything else is the most unpatriotic act you can commit, and a form of cowardice. Now, my learning is superficial. I mean, we're all ignorant, as Will Rogers said, just on different subjects. But I took a master's degree in history because I was concerned about history and, frankly, love history and have read history all my life, in part because reading's easier than thinking, but in part because I wanted to know. And I can tell you that in my humble opinion, and I think it's demonstrable beyond question, that U.S. foreign policy, let's just take the last 100 and few years, has been an absolute human tragedy. If you started with the Philippine-American War, which we don't even acknowledge in our history books, we call it the Spanish-American War. But it was 1 million Filipinos that died, not Spaniards. And we killed them relentlessly. The Senate held hearings in 1906 in which it described an order from a general to a colonel to kill all of the men on the island of Negros. We call them little niggers, not because the island was named Negros, but because they were darker skinned. And in the hearings that the Senate held, there are pictures of trenches full of bodies. The colonel asked the general what age, and he said 14 and older. And we literally tried to round up all the men, you couldn't find them all, obviously, and kill them. There was a peace movement of enormous power at that time. There were people that devoted full time to it. Mark Twain, who's one of our most underestimated Americans, spent 2 years doing nothing but traveling around the country and outside the country, talking about the wrongfulness of the Philippine-American War. There's a great Philippine historian named Constantino who's written 4 books on the Philippine-American War. You can't find them in the Library of Congress. They are translated into English. You can buy them still in Manila. It's history we need to know. It's not just that we'll be condemned to repeat it. If we don't know what we do, there is no hope. It's sad to observe that Woodrow Wilson, who was a full tenured professor at Princeton University throughout that war, never attended a rally, and there were rallies every week, and never made a speech or a comment on the war, on the slaughter. And we ought to note that, like our colony in Africa, Liberia, the Philippine people knew greater poverty and more violence than any other people thereafter in that part of the world. Their per capita income today is less than 1/20th the per capita income of Japan, which we say lost World War II. Everybody loses every war. The period up to World War I was no better. It was full of invasions and killings. Read Smedley Butler on Nicaragua and how many times we went in there. Think of Franklin Roosevelt. Now, these are people from my childhood I have revered. Woodrow Wilson, I've got his complete writings, Princeton University Press, more than 60 volumes. Great writings. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who was so inspiring that I joined the Marines when I became 17. But when he ran for vice president in 1920, he spoke time and again, proudly, about how he had written the 1915 Constitution for the Free Republic of Haiti from the deck of a U.S. destroyer off the north coast between Cuba and Haiti. It's called the Self-Determination of Nations. To think that you would be proud of writing a constitution for another people. Who are they? And how many have we written constitutions with a small c for? Time and time again. Think of the Platt Amendment, which also came out of the Spanish-American War, but 20 years later, more than 20 years later, in which we reserved the right, when we pulled out of Cuba finally, to reoccupy the country at any time on our sole determination. And just to be sure we could get in, we reserved space at Guantanamo, which we hold to this day. We've glorified our wars. We've glorified our wars against Native Americans, which were wars of extermination, genocidal, and we knew it. Talk about ethnic cleansing. What did we do to the Native Americans? We cleansed them out to places you could hardly live, and then isolated them in ways that their cultures were destroyed. It was hard for them to know and harder to rediscover who they were and where they came from. You know, you can't recount the more than 75 major U.S. interventions around the world, military interventions since 1945. I will highlight a few in the part of the world that we're all thinking the most about right now. But before I get to that part, I'd like to point out that our interventions in foreign countries on every continent have been the dominant fact in the lives of millions of people on those continents, and for generations. And we talk about our love for democracy, but when you think that the CIA called the removal of Mossadegh, a democratically elected president, and the replacement of the Shah on the peacock throne of Iran was its proudest achievement, you have to question whether we really respect democracy. The racism with which we addressed Mossadegh and the fanfare with which we praised the Shah, and for 25 years the repression that those people suffered, is beyond measure. Anyone who was there as I was in 1975 and 1976 and 1977 saw 2 million people out on the streets shouting Marg Bak Shah, wearing burial shrouds, expecting to be killed, Jolly Square on Black Friday in August of '76 when Huey helicopters, the parts manufactured in the United States but assembled in Esfahan, the pristine city of Haji Baba, flying 100 feet above the crowd and firing from open bays with 50 caliber machine guns, killed 2,000 people. And it brought on a rage and a disorientation among a people that has not been straightened out to this time. And what right did we have to do it? And what made us think good could possibly come from it? Who killed Patrice Lumumba? Years ago when I would go to Beirut, a tall, young, splendid splinter of an African man would come up to me and say, "The CIA killed my father." In more recent years, I find him in Geneva. He always has the same question. For years, I didn't know the answer. Then I met John Stockwell, who was the CIA station agent, and wrote a book called In Search of Enemies, which could be a description of U.S. foreign policy. And Stockwell, who was a Texan and a former Marine, said that the body of Patrice Lumumba, the first democratically elected prime minister of the Congo after colonial Belgium was ousted, was found in a car that belonged to the CIA. And who came after it? The worst tyrant Africa has known, worse than Idi Amin, or any other you can name, Mobutu. And for 35 years, from 1960 through 1998, that poor country was beaten into dire poverty, early death, and suffering. And we supported Mobutu all the way. That's our foreign policy. Let's skip to the Western Hemisphere. Look at South America. Allende was a medical doctor. He had a dream of universal free health care for everybody. He ran for president in '70 and was defeated with U.S. intervention, financing opposition, threatening him. He was finally elected, and then he was murdered by the leave of the United States. I went down about 5 days after the golpe, September of 1973. And you've never seen such terror in the streets. Went by the home of the great poet who I'd loved and read all my adult life, and it was gutted, burned out. You couldn't buy his books except under the counter. They were purged. And from the four-part military government, initially, one dying in a helicopter accident very quickly, and the other two fading away, emerged Pinochet. We sent Milton Friedman down, and we said it's an absolute economic miracle. The people of Chile have gotten poorer and poorer since 1973. There were thousands killed immediately. In Stadio, Chile, 5,000 killed. Victor Jara, who was the great songwriter and performer, his hands brutally smashed before they killed him. Laurie Berenson, in prison in Peru today, asked 60 political questions in her trial because they didn't have any facts. And one was why she sang the songs of Victor Jara. And she's in prison in large part because of U.S. intelligence agencies wanting meddlesome priests out of Latin America. She had no purpose but helping the poor. She has opposed violence, as has her family, all of her life. Now, we're not standing by Pinochet exactly now, but he's still tottering around in old age. But what happened to the people of Chile? And when will they come out of it? Think of our Bens in Guatemala. Guatemala is still 70% Mayan. And more than half of them are living a Mayan culture and are speaking a Mayan language. There's still about 12 Mayan languages in spite of the greatest extinction that's being inflicted on society right now, cultural extinction. There are about 45 Guatemalan Mayan languages at the end of World War II. And triage, every year since 1953, when President Eisenhower, who told us about the military-industrial complex, sent soldiers in from the United States to take out the democratically elected Arbenz. And they have known nothing but misery and violation of human rights to the highest degree since then. Marcos in the Philippines was our creation. I sat in the front row in the gallery of the House of Representatives when he was invited, something that happens to very few foreign leaders, to address a joint session of the Congress. And he made a better 4th of July speech than Patrick Henry could have, because he was our man. And finally, it took millions of people in the Philippines. There are such things as nonviolent, successful, peaceful revolutions. The Shah was forced to leave. His last year in office, 40,000 people were killed. And he gave up because he said, I can't kill everybody. And they'd shut down everything by mass protest. And Carlson Aquino was able, because of the way that the poor people who had suffered so much in the Philippines could identify with the murder of her husband. Marcos had said, Benigno Aquino shall not set foot on Philippine soil alive. And he flew in against the advice of some of his best friends, including me. And they took him down a stairway off the back of the plane, and the back of his head was blown off before he got to the tarmac. There's a powerful, huge, heroic bronze statue of Aquino falling forward with a staircase that just comes from space down like that in Makati outside of Manila. Who killed Diem in Vietnam? We did. One of my heroes, I believe in heroes. I love Wallace Stevens' poem, For What Are We to Believe If We Can't Believe in Heroes? Meaning, there are good people. There really are good people. Decent, caring, even wise sometimes. William O. Douglas is a hero of mine. In one of his many books, the one called The Court Years, he describes how he had known Diem for years, loved the man, visited him, went there in 63, early 63, came back. Douglas knew the Kennedy family intimately. He'd known the ambassador forever. He'd served on the Securities and Exchange Commission with the ambassador. He knew all the sons. He'd taken Bob to, of all countries, Afghanistan. Climbed a mountain. Bob got sick, nearly died. They had to pull him out with a helicopter. But he went to the White House, and these are his words. He said, I told Jack, our government is going to assassinate Diem. And he says, Nothing was done. We did, and Jack is responsible. Jack is responsible. I can't say I agree that Jack is responsible necessarily, but that's a heavy responsibility. But if you were watching the press early this late summer, I should say, probably August, a general officer from Vietnam said that once Diem had been executed, there was no hope for peace. That the role of the Catholic Church and religion in the peace process had ended, and we knew we had no choice but to intervene with a massive military effort. Now, shifting over to the area we're infecting right now, without any more illustrations. We've been busy in the Middle East for a long time. If we'd had a decent foreign policy before and during and after World War II, when the question of the creation of a state of Israel was raised, we could have easily said yes, but it has to be done in a way that will enable people to live peacefully together there. It's not a land without people, for people without land. There are people who live there. And if you just bulldoze them away, you're going to have trouble. It would have been a very easy thing to do. It would have been the obviously decent thing to do. We want peace in the Holy Land. It hadn't had a lot of peace. I was sitting in Beirut one day, and I was just inside the green zone with the head of the Middle East Council of Churches. We were just the two of us having lunch, and all of a sudden there's a big explosion, which doesn't surprise anybody in Beirut at that time, and machine gun fire. And we fell silent for a moment or two, and he said, "Who do you think are the most violent people that ever came to this region?" He had a marvelous library, which was destroyed when Israel invaded all the way up to the outskirts of Beirut 2 years later. But I said, "Well, you know, you're the scholar. You live here. You spent your life on it. You tell me." And he said, "Well, there's no question. It was the Christian Crusaders. They came with a single purpose, and that was to destroy every man, woman, and child that was a heathen." We don't like to think about that, you know. It certainly wasn't us, although it was some European stock. If we'd had a decent foreign policy, if we just had a little vision, in fact, we could have seen there are lots of Arabs. And people don't like to be pushed around. Do you remember what happened to Arabs in 48? And how many have been exiled ever since? The right to return is still an issue in the peace process, as we call it. And the territory available for Palestinian state, you can barely get your big toe on anymore. And there are settlements encroaching on that. Certainly we want friends, but we want to be friends with everybody. And we want our friends to be safe and secure. And we shouldn't lead them into something that makes their lives constantly miserable, because they never know when the next bomb's going off, the next bus shot up. And it didn't have to be. What we did in Iran for generations unsettled the region. It led directly to the Iran-Iraq War. There could never have been an Iran-Iraq War except for it, because Iran was our surrogate. We sold Iran $27 billion in arms between 1972 and 1976. We financed 3 major weapon systems on the oil money that Iran paid us for advanced weapons. They had more tanks than the British Army. They had Sidewinder missiles before any ally, including UK. They had a huge military. They had a Savak intelligence that saturated every place, including American campuses like the University of Minnesota. And despite the fact that it violated our laws, the Shah could come here and appear on a Sunday morning interview show and answer the question, does he have agents here? He said, certainly we have agents here. We've got students here from Iran who are troublemakers. And we've got to prevent them from doing harm to you and harm to us. And the psychological effect of Savak on those students here, there are more than 50,000 Iranian students in Southern California. Half of them studying things without anyone speaking Farsi in the whole university. They weren't getting a very good education, but they were at least enrolled and paying full tuition through the government. They were our surrogate economically. They were an advanced distribution center for and assembly center for major industries of the United States. We had investments there that were enormous. They were on the soft underbelly of the Soviet Union. On Dimovan, the 17,000-foot mountain that you can sometimes see on a clear day from Tehran, you can see the test range for the major test range at that time for Soviet missiles. Iran was of critical importance to us. And when it collapsed, we didn't know what to do. I was in a place called Gazvin in Iran the day the Shah left, and we saw the plane going over, and somehow or other the people knew, and they just went ecstatic, and we drove back to the capital, got there, and it was like Times Square all over Tehran on VJ Day. Hundreds of Iranians I'd known were delirious with joy. A day they thought was in the distant future had suddenly come. We went by that night and saw Bakhtiar, who had been, he was the youngest minister under the democratically elected President Mossadegh, and he'd become prime minister. It was a bad mistake for the Shah, and the Shah had empowered him to carry on the government when he fled. And after we'd talked for a while, I said, I need to make a phone call. Can I use the phone? He said, you'll have to ask him. The guy was a prisoner. There's a guy standing over there with a gun, and I went over and asked him, could I use the phone? He said, sure. Not in English, but we had a translator. The next morning, I went to see Sullivan, who was our ambassador. He's one of these brilliant American-trained diplomats that knows everything, articulate. He's the one that told me if I went to Vietnam, to Hanoi, during the bombing of the dikes in August, I'd be prosecuted when I got back. And we went, and they didn't have the courage to prosecute, but they made a big fuss about it. Mother didn't like it. I didn't care too much for it myself. He was the one also that spotted the places to bomb in Cambodia. Our secret bombing in Cambodia was no secret from the Cambodians. I shouldn't have to tell you that, because they detected something was happening when the bombs exploded. And now he was ambassador in Iran. I'd never seen him in a reflective mood. Our diplomats don't reflect. But he was slumped back because he's a bantam rooster. And he said, I guess the meaning of all this is you have to smash it down before it starts. That's a quote. And that's our policy. What we've done to Iraq is beyond human imagination. First, we showed that we can destroy a country without setting foot on it. the Pentagon concedes we flew 110,000 aerial sorties in 42 days. I figured it out one time. That's one every 30 seconds of every minute of every hour, 24 hours a day, for 42 days. They delivered 88,500 tons of bombs, according to the Pentagon. That's the equivalent of 7.5 Hiroshimas. But we just didn't make 7.5 great big pockmarks in the country. We acted very democratically. We scattered them around, something for everybody. And we systematically destroyed the life support systems for the society. If you just take water, we hit the reservoirs and bombed the dams. We hit the pipeline systems that brought the water down. We hit the pumping stations. We hit the storage tanks. We hit the filtration plants. There wasn't a drop of running water in Iraq when I got there on Groundhog Day, February the 2nd, 1991, the end of the second week of the bombing. No running water. People were going to the Tigris and taking buckets of water. And they'd try to boil it or something, or sometimes they'd be too thirsty and just drink it. And I went by to see the head of the Red Crescent, which is affiliated with the ICRC, the International Committee for the Red Cross, and is the Red Cross equivalent in a Muslim country. The guy who had been trained in England, as all their doctors had done his internship at Children's Hospital there, had headed the Children's Hospital in Baghdad, and had become the head of the Red Crescent, and was delivering all the medicines that were available, which were very few. They were bringing some in from Jordan with 7 trucks they had. And he said, we've lost 12,000 children to bad water. We don't have rehydration tablets. Their mothers are malnourished. We've been under sanctions since August the 5th. We imposed sanctions on Hiroshima Day of 1990. And we've kept them on to this day. And I'll add that twice as many people have died of the sanctions in Iraq. Most children under the age of 5 than died in the World Trade Center on September the 11th of 2001. And I don't know if there's a comparison in cruelty of deaths, but I'll tell you this, if your child can go in a sudden explosion or it can wither away over a period of weeks or months or years, take it fast. It's better for everybody. We have deliberately inflicted a policy on that country that has taken the lives of more than 1.5 million people, and the world knows it. We all remember when Madeleine Albright on 60 Minutes was told about a World Food Program report that said more than 500,000, this was 1996, more than 500,000 children under the age of 5 have died as a direct result of the sanctions. And she was asked by Leslie Stahl, is the price worth it? I don't know why she phrased it that way, but usually says it's worth the price. But and Madeleine Albright looked right in the camera, because that's what you're supposed to do, and said, that's a difficult question, but yes, we think the price is worth it. Well, what moral being could ever say anything is worth 500,000 children's lives, or one child's life? Can you think that way? What kind of foreign policy is that? We build a Trident II nuclear submarine. It's the most deadly weapon ever created. It's beyond imagination. It's unusable. It can launch, we commissioned 20 of them, and there are 14 out there in the water now. Some may be in dock, but there are 14 that are operational. They can launch 24 missiles simultaneously, 12 from each side. This boat is as long as the Washington Monument is tall. 555 feet for the monument. This thing's about 580 feet, except it's a lot bigger around. And each missile can have up to 17 independently targeted maneuverable nuclear warheads that can travel a distance of 7,000 nautical miles. You fire one that way and you fire one that way, and you go 14,000 nautical miles, halfway around Mother Earth's ample waste. You can take out a hemisphere with 408 strikes from a single launch, and a warhead 10 times more powerful than the bomb that incinerated Nagasaki une belle dee, a bomb more powerful than the Hiroshima bomb. And perhaps render the Earth lifeless, who knows? I mean, the fallout from 408 nuclear explosions of that magnitude at approximately the same time, God knows what it would mean. Just like we don't know what depleted uranium means. Iraq is full of depleted uranium. It's got a half-life of billions of years. It can kill you. The incidence of leukemia and tumors and cancers in infants and fetuses and children, and particularly among Bedouins out in the desert area west of Basra, is 5- and 6-fold up. The Italians are worried. They don't realize that the death rate is still going up in Iraq. The Italians had lost 6 or 7 soldiers from a brief period of time they'd had there. In Afghanistan, we deliberately financed, trained, armed, and sent thousands from the United States of people, primarily Arabs and Arab Americans, many African Americans who were Muslims, to Afghanistan. And our purpose was to drive the Soviets out. And we knew bin Laden perfectly well. He was one of the principal people involved in that struggle. And we helped finance him. In a very real sense, we created the Taliban. It's our creature, just as Mobutu was our creature. More directly and easily because it's an individual. One of the jokes about 5 or 6 years ago when they were talking about indicting bin Laden was, why are we so angry at bin Laden? He did more to cause the fall of the Soviet Empire than Ronald Reagan. Because their economy couldn't stand that drain. And their families didn't like those body bags any more than we liked them from Vietnam, but our economy was strong. Look at what happens to our enemies. Encyclopedia Britannica will tell you that 4 million civilians died in Korea during the Korean War. 2.5 million in the north. That war has been over for nearly 50 years. And there's malnutrition, constant hunger, and 2 years ago there were thousands of deaths by starvation. In Vietnam, from 1945, when the war with the French started, until 1975, when we flew off the top of the embassy in Saigon, the strength of the Vietnamese economy increased. They were producing 5 tons of rice per hectare by tender loving care for every shoot and working night and day, all the women and children out there, because the men were underground, living in caves, a pair of tennis shoes and pants and some bullets and a rifle, a little sack of rice for years. The sanctions from 1975 to 1995 on Vietnam, when we lifted them, killed more people than 30 years of war, from 45 to 75. Killed more people. But more than that, it broke the spirit, because suddenly you couldn't see the cause of your misery. You couldn't see a future for your children. You were taken to boats in the South China Sea and trying to get someplace. People who had fought for a generation to determine their own destiny on their own land. And we brought their per capita income down finally below that of Mozambique, which was $80 per capita income per year. That was our foreign policy. We invaded Grenada. Everybody had a job in Grenada. There were no drugs, no crime. There hadn't been a murder in Grenada or a serious injury from a violent assault from 1979 to 1983 during the New Jewel movement. Today, 60% of the population is unemployed and the rest is underemployed, virtually. And you walk around the Carnage down in St. George's, and the young men are laying around and peddling and using drugs. And you better hang on to your wallet and don't go out at night. It would have been very easy to have a Marshall Plan for Grenada. It didn't have 100,000 people. We killed more people in 3 days there in proportion to their population than we lost in all fronts in all years of World War II. It's a statistical trick because it's not very many people. It's just a few hundred people. But to them it mattered. Everybody knew some of the people that were killed. And we didn't care enough to help them a bit when it was all over. We've had a foreign policy that's based upon a desire for political and geographic domination and economic advantage and exploitation on all fronts. Trade, finance, labor, and we have rendered the poor of the planet miserable. And as we sit in this beautiful church this evening, Peacemakers, the poor are getting poorer. The poor countries are getting poorer. The poor in the rich countries are getting poorer. And the rich are getting richer. The rich nations and the rich people. I watched Alejandro Toledo, the president of Peru. I'm a romantic and optimist, so you can't take me too seriously. But for a full-blooded descendant of Inca Indians to rise to the presidency of Peru is thrilling to me. He was one of 16 children. Absolute poverty. When he was 5, he started working, shining shoes on the streets of Lima. He was bright, he got into school somehow or other. Some church people helped him along. And somehow or other he got into college and he did good. And Stanford gave him a scholarship and some people who came to know him and he got a PhD. He tried to run against Fujimori and was beaten back. He's being interviewed on public television and asked what you think about Montesinos, who's this guy who corrupted a lot of stuff down there in the Fujimori administration. He said, well, I can't worry about those things. He said, our poverty is absolutely staggering. I have to work full time trying to see that our people have more food, more housing, and more opportunity to learn, more health care. He said, you can't imagine the poverty of our people, and he started describing it. There was an earlier president, elected twice in Mexico, full-blooded Zapotec Indian. The probabilities that he would have lived at the age of 5 were about 60%. That's what the death rate was. 40% would die before they reached the age of 5. Infant mortality was about 250 out of 1,000 live births within the first year. He was taken in by some priests, and he was bright, and he got educated and went to law school and was elected president. When Mexico gave its gift to the United Nations, in the United Nations building in New York, there's a gift from every nation. And right outside the General Assembly Hall is a big stone, lava from Mexico, and carved in it is this statement from Benito Juarez: "A respect for the rights of others is peace." We have to have a foreign policy that respects the rights of others. I read a headline on page 12 of the Chicago Tribune, which I picked up in Chicago on the way out here this afternoon. And it said, it was a little surprising to see it, although I knew it would be true. It said, "Afghan rebels rejoice in looting and assassinating captives." And the story went on to describe some minor looting and a few shootings, one guy twice in the chest. Well, what do you expect? Who do we think we are, you know? You really think you can go in there and bomb the place and everybody's going to live happily ever after? Where has it ever happened? Ask the people of the Congo. Ask the people of Iran or Iraq or Guatemala or Vietnam or the Philippines or Chile how much good they got out of our interventions and how much they suffer to this day. The failure, basically, I think, because we're a decent people, given half a chance. We're pretty battered right now. I mean, if you just take the assault of the media, we were always gunfighters. I mean, we always loved gunfighting. And Rambo became the modern gunfighter, and finally the Trident too. But that is totally immoral and unacceptable. It can only lead to violence and death. And we saturate ourselves with the glorification of violence. We love violence. We're teaching our children to love violence. Ole Rolvog spotted it years and years ago in The Giants in the Earth. A powerful book you ought to read again. And here are these pioneers, and they've come over here from Sweden or wherever it was, and maybe Norway, I can't remember at the moment. And they get out to Minnesota, and they're still heading west. And they've never had guns. They've never wanted guns. They don't want guns. And the son that they want to be the President of the United States, comes home with a gun. And the family has a huge fight. We don't want guns. We don't believe in guns. We don't want that gun in our house. And the son wants the gun. And the other failure that we have is our love of material things. And we'll destroy the planet. I mean, we're more interested in a new acquisition than we are saving a child from starvation. There are 10, 15 million infants that starve to death every year, and it doesn't have to be. Surely we're clever enough to find out ways to feed all the children, if we care. It could even be fun, if you like babies. But we're too interested in material things. We revere great wealth. We respect the wealthy as moral. And we let major corporations run rampant. The day that NAFTA became effective was January the 1st, 1994. And all of a sudden, the whole world was shocked because of the revolution from Chiapas, the Zapatistas. We thought, what are these crazy people doing? A bunch of Mayans down there coming out of the rainforest and raising hell, shooting up the whole place. They took over every major city except Tuxtla Gutierrez, literally. Broke open all the jails, took all the records out of courthouses and burned them. But it was nonviolent, basically. The only time there was shooting was around the jails because the guards shot at them and they were determined to let all the prisoners out. And then they were driven back in by 50,000 soldiers armed by the United States with U.S. helicopters. But what happened? First, Chiapas was the only state in Mexico that exported corn. All the others consumed more than they produced. The Mayans believed in their religion that they were made of corn. And if, as Gaylord Hauser used to say, we are what we eat, they were, because 60% of their caloric intake was corn. Well, at Laredo, Texas, which is the biggest internal port in the United States, 14 and 16-wheel tractor-trailer trucks were backed up for 7 miles, loaded with corn, surplus U.S. corn. And it rolled down into Mexico. And the wholesale price of corn dropped 40% on the 2nd day of January 1994. And the Mayan Indians were smart enough to know what was going to happen, and we didn't know and we didn't care. And they knew it was the end of their culture because they knew that the necessities that the New World brought on them, purified water and things like that, could only be purchased by the sale of corn. They couldn't sell corn anymore. And soon they'd be begging on the streets, all the way up to Monterey and Guadalajara. And we praise that while we take sweat labor, putting our workers out of business from poor countries paying 12, 40 cents an hour. Women working 70 hours a week, can't take care of their own children, barely able to make it. Unless our people become involved in foreign policy, it will continue just as it has. The idea that we're a two-party system and that there's a difference in the parties is absolutely wrong. There has been no change in our foreign policy from one administration to the other since the turn of the century.